The Callaway estate was a sight to behold, nestled in the heart of Napa Valley. Acres of meticulously maintained vineyards stretched as far as the eye could see, their leaves turning shades of amber and crimson under the setting sun. At the estate's center stood the mansion, a grand structure with arched windows, sprawling verandas, and marble columns that whispered of its owner's immense wealth. But no amount of grandeur could mask the void that filled its halls. Henry Callaway, a 76-year-old retired real estate magnate, sat on the balcony of his second-floor study, swirling a glass of Merlot absent-mindedly. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he gazed at the vineyards. He had built an empire, amassed riches beyond imagination, yet his heart carried the weight of solitude. The death of his wife, Eleanor, and the estrangement of his son, Michael, left him with only echoes of laughter and memories that faded with each passing year. The evening air carried a crispness, signaling the arrival of autumn. Henry sighed, finishing his wine, and decided to take his usual walk through the gardens. It was his only solace, a way to escape the hollow silence of the mansion. As he walked along the stone pathway, the crunch of gravel beneath his shoes was the only sound that accompanied him. His footsteps faltered when he spotted movement near the estate's wrought iron gates. Squinting through the dim light, he saw a figure huddled on the ground, a woman with a young girl asleep beside her. Her clothes were worn and dirty, and a battered backpack sat at her feet. Henry's first instinct was caution. After all, strangers near the estate were rare. Yet something about the scene, a mother shielding her child from the biting cold, stirred something within him. He approached cautiously, his voice calm yet firm. "Ma'am, are you all right?" The woman stirred, her eyes snapping open with alarm. She clutched the child protectively and grabbed the backpack, ready to flee. "I'm sorry," she stammered. "We didn't mean to trespass. We'll leave." "Wait," Henry said, raising a hand to stop her. "You look like you need help." The woman hesitated, her brown eyes darting between Henry and the gate. Her face, though marked by exhaustion, carried traces of dignity. "We don't want any trouble," she murmured. Henry softened his tone. "I'm not here to trouble you. My name is Henry Callaway. This is my property. You can stay the night in the guest house. It's warm and safe." The woman bit her lip, clearly torn. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Emma. My name's Emma Porter. This is my daughter, Lila." Henry nodded. "Emma, Lila, come with me." As they walked to the guest house, Emma's wariness was palpable. She kept Lila close, her eyes scanning the surroundings as though expecting danger to pounce at any moment. Henry noted her protectiveness with a quiet admiration. When they reached the guest house, a modest structure compared to the mansion, he opened the door and gestured inside. "It's not much, but it'll keep you warm," he said. Emma looked around, the weight of her circumstances etched on her face. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice cracking. Henry left them with a nod, giving them space to settle in. But as he walked back to the mansion, he couldn't shake the image of Emma's haunted eyes and the quiet innocence of Lila. Something told him that this chance encounter was more than mere coincidence. Perhaps, after years of emptiness, this was the beginning of something that could bring meaning back into his life. The guest house sat on the far end of the sprawling Callaway estate, a modest structure tucked between towering oaks and flower-laden trellises. Its red-bricked exterior contrasted sharply with the opulence of the main mansion, but to Emma Porter, it might as well have been a palace. She clutched her daughter Lila's hand tightly as they followed Henry Callaway into the cozy space. The inside was simple but welcoming. A small living area with a well-worn couch, a tiny kitchen with a functional stove, and a bedroom with neatly folded blankets atop a twin bed. Lila's tired eyes lit up at the sight of the bed, a haven she hadn't known in weeks. "It's warm," Emma said, her voice thick with emotion. She had fought hard to maintain her dignity during the brief walk from the gate, but here, in this quiet sanctuary, her walls began to crack. Henry nodded, his expression unreadable. "You'll be safe here for the night. If you need anything, I'm just a call away." He placed a landline phone on the kitchen counter. "There's a bathroom down the hall. Make yourselves comfortable." Emma hesitated, then murmured, "Thank you." It was all she could muster. Henry inclined his head slightly before stepping out, closing the door gently behind him. For a moment, Emma stood in the middle of the room, her shoulders hunched under an invisible weight. Then she knelt to Lila's level, brushing the girl's dark hair back from her face. "Are you okay, baby?" she asked, her voice trembling. Lila nodded, her eyes scanning the room with the wonder only a child could muster in dire circumstances. "It's night, Mom. Do you think he's really going to let us stay?" Emma swallowed hard. "Just for tonight, sweetheart. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." Back in the grand halls of the Calloway mansion, Henry returned to his study, pouring himself a second glass of Merlot. The weight of what he'd done began to settle in. He wasn't a man prone to impulsive decisions, yet something about Emma and Lila had stirred a dormant part of him. Perhaps it was the way Emma shielded her daughter with such fierce determination, or the quiet innocence in Lila's eyes. Whatever the reason, Henry felt compelled to act. "Mr. Calloway." A sharp voice broke his thoughts. It was Mrs. Miriam, his housekeeper of over 3 decades. She stood in the doorway, her brow furrowed in concern. "Is it true you've invited strangers to stay on the property?" Henry sighed, swirling his glass. "Yes, Miriam, it's true." She stepped closer, her posture stiff. "With all due respect, sir, this is highly irregular. We don't know anything about them. They could be dangerous." "They're not," Henry replied firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "They're just a mother and child in need. That's all." Miriam hesitated, but eventually nodded, though her disapproval lingered in the air. "If you're certain, I'll prepare breakfast for them in the morning." As the hours passed, Emma found herself unable to sleep. Lila, on the other hand, had drifted off almost instantly, her small frame curled up under the blankets. Emma sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea she'd made with the provisions in the pantry. Her thoughts swirled like a storm. What if this was all a mistake? What if she'd endangered Lila by accepting the kindness of a stranger? Her eyes wandered to a small photograph on the wall. It was of a younger Henry, his arm around a smiling woman. The happiness in their expressions felt almost foreign to her. "You're overthinking," she muttered to herself, shaking her head. But the past was always there, lurking in the shadows of her mind. Images of Ryan's face, his voice dripping with venom, haunted her. His threats echoed in her ears. "You'll never escape me, Emma." A sudden knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She froze, her heart racing. Rising slowly, she tiptoed to the door and peered through the small peephole. Relief flooded her as she saw Henry standing there, holding a folded blanket. "I thought you might need this," he said when she opened the door. Emma accepted the blanket, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." Henry hesitated, his sharp eyes studying her face. "You should rest. You look like you haven't slept in days." "I haven't," Emma admitted, before she could stop herself. She quickly averted her gaze, embarrassed by her candor. Henry nodded, as though he understood more than he let on. "Good night, Emma." "Good night, Mr. Calloway," she replied, watching as he walked back toward the mansion. The next morning, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the guest house. Emma stirred awake to the sight of Lila sitting at the small table, sketching with a pencil and a scrap of paper she'd found. The child's face was serene, her tongue peeking out in concentration. "What are you drawing, baby?" Emma asked, stretching. Lila turned the paper around to reveal a rough but detailed sketch of the guest house. Emma couldn't help but smile. "It's beautiful." Just then, there was a soft knock at the door. Emma opened it to find Mrs. Miriam standing there, holding a tray laden with food, eggs, toast, and a small bowl of fruit. "Mr. Calloway asked me to bring this over," Miriam said briskly, though her tone softened when she saw Lila peeking out from behind her mother. "Good morning, young lady." "Good morning," Lila replied shyly. Miriam hesitated before placing the tray on the table. "If you need anything, let me know." "Thank you," Emma said, her gratitude genuine. As Miriam left, Emma sat down with Lila to eat. For the first time in weeks, they shared a meal without fear gnawing at their every bite. Later that day, as Emma hung freshly washed clothes outside the guest house, she noticed a car idling at the end of the estate's driveway. Her stomach clenched with unease, but before she could focus on it further, Lila called her name from inside. Emma cast one last wary glance toward the car before retreating inside, a faint sense of foreboding settling over her. The guest house settled into the rhythm of Emma and Lila's presence as days turned into weeks. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Emma could breathe without the immediate fear of survival clouding her thoughts. Yet, her guard remained firmly in place, every kindness from Henry Calloway met with cautious gratitude. For Henry, the arrival of Emma and Lila was a curious disruption in his routine, a disruption that, much to his surprise, he welcomed. Henry was in the garden pruning the rose bushes one morning when he heard Lila's voice. It was soft at first, barely audible over the rustle of the breeze, but as he turned, he found her standing near the trellis with a notebook and pencil in hand. "Mr. Calloway?" she asked shyly. Henry straightened, brushing dirt from his gloves. "Yes, Lila." "Can I draw the roses? They're really pretty." A small smile tugged at the corners of Henry's mouth. "Of course you can, but only if you promise to show me the masterpiece when it's finished." Lila giggled, her cheeks flushing with delight. She plopped down on the grass and began sketching with intense focus, her small hands moving quickly over the paper. Henry watched her for a moment before returning to his work, a warmth spreading through his chest that he hadn't felt in years. Meanwhile, Emma kept herself busy with chores around the estate. She insisted on contributing in some way, despite Henry's protests that she didn't owe him anything. She cleaned the guest house meticulously, helped Miriam in the kitchen, and even took to weeding the vegetable garden behind the mansion. "Emma," Henry said one afternoon as he passed her in the garden, "you don't have to do all this, you know." Emma straightened, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I know," she replied simply, "but I need to." Henry studied her for a moment, noting the lines of determination etched into her face. He nodded. "If it makes you feel better, then so be it. But don't overwork yourself." That evening, as the sun dipped low, Lila approached Henry with her notebook clutched to her chest. "I'm done," she announced. Henry set his glass of wine aside and gestured for her to come closer. Lila handed him the notebook, her expression a mix of pride and nervousness. Henry opened it to find a detailed sketch of the rose garden, the delicate petals captured with surprising precision for someone so young. "This is incredible," he said, genuinely impressed. "You have quite the talent, Lila." Lila beamed, and Emma, who had been watching from the doorway, smiled softly. It was a rare moment of lightness, one that felt almost normal. Henry closed the notebook and handed it back. "You know, my wife Eleanor was an artist. She would have loved your work." Lila's eyes widened. "Really? Was she good?" "She was exceptional," Henry said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "The best I've ever known." Later that night, Henry found himself in the old study, where Eleanor had spent countless hours painting. The room had been untouched since her passing, the easel and brushes gathering dust. He traced a finger along the edge of a paint-streaked table, his heart heavy with memories. As he stood there, he realized how much Lila's sketches reminded him of Eleanor's early works. It was as though a part of her spirit had returned to the estate. Back in the guest house, Emma tucked Lila into bed, her heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and fear. She had seen the way Henry looked at Lila, not with pity, but with genuine admiration and care. Yet Emma couldn't shake the fear that this fragile piece could be shattered at any moment. Her thoughts drifted to the strange car she'd seen idling near the driveway the day before. Was it just a coincidence, or had Ryan found them? She shuddered at the thought, vowing to remain vigilant. The following day, as Emma hung laundry in the backyard, she spotted the car again, parked farther down the road. Her hands trembled as she clutched a sheet, her mind racing. Before she could decide what to do, Henry called out from the main house, Emma, come inside for lunch." Emma hesitated, casting one last glance at the car before heading toward the mansion. The sense of foreboding lingered, but she pushed it aside for Lila's sake. For now they were safe. That had to be enough. That evening, Emma and Lila joined Henry for dinner in the grand dining room. The room, with its high ceilings and ornate chandeliers, was a stark contrast to the modest meals Emma had grown accustomed to. "Do you ever get lonely in this big house?" Lila asked innocently as she nibbled on a piece of bread. Henry chuckled softly. "Sometimes, yes, but lately not as much." Emma glanced at him, her eyes meeting his briefly. She knew what he meant, though neither of them said it aloud. As the evening drew to a close, Henry walked Emma and Lila back to the guest house. The moon cast long shadows across the estate, and the night air was cool and still. "Good night," Henry said as they reached the door. "Good night, Mr. Calloway," Emma replied. Lila waved, her sketchbook tucked under her arm. Henry watched them disappear inside before turning back toward the mansion. For the first time in years, the silence of the estate didn't feel so oppressive. Yet, in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the feeling that their fragile peace was about to be tested. The morning light filtered through the vineyard, casting golden hues on the sprawling estate. Emma stood by the guest house window, watching Lila sketch the garden with her ever-present notebook. The serenity of the scene was deceptive. Emma's mind was still consumed by the memory of the strange car. She hadn't mentioned it to Henry or Lila, but the growing knot of anxiety in her chest was hard to ignore. Henry, meanwhile, was sipping coffee on the mansion's veranda, glancing occasionally toward the guest house. For the first time in years, his mornings felt less hollow, filled instead with a quiet sense of purpose. Later that day, Emma joined Henry in the kitchen to help Miriam prepare lunch. The housekeeper was still wary of Emma, her glances sharp and scrutinizing. But Henry's insistence on Emma's presence softened Miriam's demeanor slightly. As Miriam stepped out briefly to fetch some herbs from the garden, Henry turned to Emma. "You don't have to help, you know." "I want to," Emma replied, chopping vegetables with precision. "It keeps my mind occupied." Henry leaned against the counter, studying her. "You've been here for a few weeks now. You've barely spoken about yourself." Emma hesitated, her hands faltering for a moment. She placed the knife down and met Henry's gaze, her eyes heavy with unspoken burdens. "It's complicated. I've got time," Henry said gently. Taking a deep breath, Emma began to speak. "I used to have a life, a good one. I worked as an office assistant, nothing fancy, but it was stable. Then Lila came along, and everything changed, for the better at first. But then I met Ryan." The name hung in the air like a storm cloud. Emma's voice wavered, but she pressed on. "He was charming, successful, everything I thought I wanted. But it didn't take long for the cracks to show. He controlled every part of my life, my money, my time, even the way I spoke to people." Henry's brow furrowed, his hands tightening around his coffee mug. "And Lila?" "I left him to protect her," Emma admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "When I found out he was involved in illegal dealings, art fraud, money laundering, I confronted him. He became violent. That's when I knew I had to leave. I packed what little I could carry, took Lila, and disappeared." Henry's expression was grim, his respect for Emma deepening. "That couldn't have been easy." "It wasn't," Emma said, tears welling in her eyes. "But I had no choice. He's still out there, Henry. And if he finds us—" She trailed off, her voice choked with fear. Henry reached out, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You're safe here. I won't let anything happen to you or Lila." Emma nodded, her gratitude evident. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she wasn't entirely alone in her fight. That evening, as Lila worked on a new drawing in the guest house, Henry invited Emma to sit with him on the veranda. The stars twinkled above, and the air was crisp with the promise of autumn. "Since we're sharing," Henry began, swirling a glass of brandy, "I suppose it's only fair I tell you a little about myself." Emma looked at him curiously. She had pieced together bits of his life, from what Miriam and Lila had mentioned, but Henry remained something of an enigma. "I wasn't always alone," he said, his voice tinged with melancholy. "My wife, Eleanor, she was everything, kind, talented, stubborn as hell. She was an artist, you know. She painted the most beautiful landscapes. This estate was her sanctuary." "What happened to her?" Emma asked softly. "Cancer," Henry replied, his voice cracking slightly. "It took her 10 years ago. And after that, well, I made some mistakes. My son, Michael, and I had a falling out. He wanted nothing to do with the family business, and I didn't handle it well." Emma listened intently, her heart aching for the man who had opened his home to her and Lila. "Do you still talk to him?" Henry shook his head. "It's been years. I don't even know where he is now." The silence between them was heavy, but not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people carrying wounds that time had not yet healed. The next morning, Lila wandered into the guest house's small storage closet, searching for extra paper for her sketches. She stumbled upon a dusty box, labeled Eleanor. Inside were old photographs, paintbrushes, and a sketchbook, filled with delicate pencil drawings of the estate. "Mom, look!" Lila exclaimed, bringing the sketchbook to Emma. Emma flipped through the pages, marveling at the intricate detail. "These are beautiful. I want to draw like this," Lila said, her eyes wide with admiration. Emma smiled, though a pang of sadness tugged at her heart. She saw the same spark in Lila that she had once carried herself, a spark that Ryan had tried to extinguish. That evening, as Emma tidied up the guest house, she spotted the strange car again, parked just beyond the vineyard. Her heart raced as she pulled the curtains shut, willing herself to stay calm. When Henry came by later to check on them, Emma hesitated but decided to tell him. "There's a car. It's been near the property twice now. Henry's expression darkened. What kind of car? Black sedan. Tinted windows, Emma replied, her voice trembling. Henry nodded, his mind already racing with possibilities. I'll handle it. You focus on Lila. The next day, Henry instructed Miriam to keep an eye out for anything unusual. He also called Charles Grant, an old friend and trusted lawyer, to discuss precautions. Do you think it's him? Charles asked over the phone. I don't know, Henry admitted, but I'm not taking any chances. Amid the tension, Henry found himself drawn to Lila's sketches. He suggested that she and Emma use Eleanor's old art studio in the mansion. At first, Emma hesitated, but Lila's excitement won her over. As they stepped into the studio, dust motes dancing in the sunlight, Emma felt a pang of bittersweet nostalgia. She hadn't touched a brush in years, but something about the space, about Henry's quiet encouragement, made her wonder if she could find that part of herself again. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the mansion's art studio, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air. Lila stood at the center of the room, her eyes wide as she took in the space. Easels of varying sizes lined the walls. Brushes and palettes sat neatly on wooden shelves, and a large canvas rested against the far wall. The faint smell of turpentine and aged paint lingered, evoking a sense of timeless artistry. Mom, look, Lila exclaimed, running to a table covered in old sketches and half-finished paintings. It's like a treasure chest. Emma stepped into the room hesitantly, her gaze scanning the familiar yet distant tools of her past. It had been years since she'd held a brush, but the sight of the studio stirred something deep within her, a flicker of a forgotten dream. Eleanor used to paint here, Henry said from the doorway. She would spend hours in this room. When I saw Lila's sketches, it reminded me of her. I thought, maybe this space could inspire you both. Emma turned to Henry, her voice soft. This is too much, Henry. We can't accept this. Henry smiled gently. You can, and you should. It's been too long since this room was alive with creativity. Lila wasted no time setting up at an easel, her small hands expertly arranging pencils and paints. She dipped a brush into a pot of blue paint and began sweeping it across the canvas with determined strokes. Emma watched from a distance, a mix of pride and trepidation filling her chest. She's a natural, Henry remarked, standing beside Emma. She gets it from her father, Emma replied quietly, her tone tinged with both admiration and pain. He was an artist, too, before things changed. Henry nodded, sensing the weight of her words, but choosing not to press further. Instead, he gestured to a blank canvas on the opposite side of the room. Why don't you join her? Emma hesitated, her hands clenching at her sides. I wouldn't even know where to start. There's only one way to find out, Henry said with a gentle smile. For days, Emma busied herself with household tasks, avoiding the studio, despite Lila's excited pleas for her to join. Each time she passed the doorway, memories of her past life with Ryan surged forward, memories of his sharp criticisms and the stifling control he had exerted over her work. One evening, as Emma was folding laundry in the guest house, Lila approached her with a sketchbook in hand. Mom, can you help me with this? I'm trying to draw the vineyard, but I can't get the shadows right. Emma looked at the page, her artist's eye immediately spotting areas for improvement. You need to soften the lines here, she said, taking the pencil and demonstrating, and add a little more contrast to the darker areas. Lila watched intently, her face lighting up. You're really good at this, Mom. You should paint with me in the studio. Emma's breath hitched, her resolve wavering. Maybe, she said softly. We'll see. That night, as Emma lay awake in bed, a knock at the guest house door startled her. She rose cautiously, her heart pounding, and opened the door to find Miriam holding an envelope. This was left at the gate, Miriam said, her voice tinged with suspicion. It's addressed to you. Emma took the envelope, her fingers trembling. She thanked Miriam and closed the door before sitting at the table to open it. Inside was a single piece of paper with a chilling message scrawled in bold handwriting. I know where you are. You can't hide forever. Emma's blood ran cold. She clutched the letter tightly, her mind racing. Ryan had found them. She was sure of it. The next morning, Emma found Henry in the garden, tending to the roses. She held the letter in her hand, her grip tight. Henry, we need to talk. Henry turned, immediately noticing the fear in her eyes. What's wrong? Wordlessly, Emma handed him the letter. Henry read it, his jaw tightening. It's him, isn't it? Ryan. Emma nodded, her voice trembling. I don't know how he found us, but we can't stay here. I can't put you and Lila in danger. You're not going anywhere, Henry said firmly. We'll figure this out. I'll call Charles and see what legal steps we can take. In the meantime, you and Lila are staying right here, where I can keep you safe. Emma opened her mouth to protest, but Henry's determined expression silenced her. For the first time in years, she felt the faintest glimmer of hope that someone might actually be able to help her. Later that day, Henry convinced Emma to visit the studio. She stood before a blank canvas, the weight of the brush in her hand, both familiar and foreign. Lila worked beside her, humming softly as she painted. Emma took a deep breath and dipped the brush into a pot of red paint. Tentatively, she made her first stroke, then another, and another. Before she knew it, she was lost in the rhythm of creation, her fears momentarily forgotten. Henry watched from the doorway, a smile tugging at his lips. The studio, once a symbol of loss, was alive again. That evening, as Emma and Lila returned to the guest house, Henry stood on the veranda, gazing out at the vineyard. The sunset bathed the landscape in gold, but his thoughts were clouded with unease. The letter was a stark reminder that Emma's past was not as far away as they had hoped. In the distance, the faint silhouette of a black sedan lingered at the edge of the property before disappearing into the night. Despite the looming threat, Emma began spending more time in the studio. Each brushstroke felt like a step toward reclaiming a part of herself she thought she had lost forever. Lila's enthusiasm was infectious, her laughter filling the once silent room. Henry, too, found himself drawn to the studio, not to paint, but to watch. He felt a sense of pride in the small family they had become, even as he worried about what lay ahead. The studio had become a haven for Emma and Lila, a world apart from their past struggles. Morning light flooded through the arched windows, illuminating canvases, brushes, and the beginnings of new masterpieces. Lila's laughter echoed as she sat cross-legged on the floor, mixing colors with carefree delight. Emma stood before an easel, her hands moving with newfound confidence as the vivid strokes of her painting took shape. For Henry, the studio was a place of solace as well. He spent hours watching Emma and Lila work, marveling at how the once dusty space had come alive again. The room seemed to hum with energy, the air thick with creativity, and the faint scent of turpentine. But beneath the surface, Emma's mind was a whirlpool of conflicting emotions. While her hands painted scenes of beauty, her thoughts often drifted back to the ominous letter she'd received. Every time she glanced toward the window, she half expected to see Ryan's shadow lurking just beyond the tree line. One afternoon, as Emma stepped back to admire her latest painting, a vivid portrait of Lila in the garden, Henry entered the studio, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You've been busy," he remarked, setting the cups on a nearby table. Emma smiled faintly. "It feels good to create again." "But—" she trailed off, her gaze dropping to the floor. Henry tilted his head, his brow furrowing. "But—" Emma hesitated, then sighed. "It's hard to enjoy this when I know he's out there. That letter, it's like he's always one step behind us." Henry placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We're taking steps to ensure your safety. Charles is gathering information, and I've instructed Miriam to keep an eye on anything unusual. You're not alone in this fight, Emma." Emma nodded, her gratitude evident in her tear-filled eyes. "Thank you, Henry, for everything." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Miriam approached the guest house with a package in her hands. "This was left at the gate," she said, her voice laced with concern. Emma frowned as she took the package. It was wrapped in brown paper, unmarked, except for her name scrawled across the top. She carried it inside, her hands trembling slightly as she opened it. Inside was a framed photograph of her and Lila, taken years ago during a rare moment of peace. But someone had scrawled across the glass, in red marker, "You can't hide forever." Emma's breath caught in her throat. She dropped the frame as though it burned her, the glass shattering on the floor. Lila rushed in from the other room, alarmed by the noise. "Mom?" "What happened?" Lila asked, her voice trembling. Emma quickly wiped her tears and forced a smile. "Nothing, sweetheart. Just an accident." But her shaking hands betrayed her, and Lila's wide eyes lingered on the broken photograph. That night, Emma showed Henry the photograph. He examined it silently, his jaw tightening with anger. "This is harassment," he said finally. "We need to involve the authorities." Emma shook her head, fear flashing across her face. "Ryan has connections. If he knows the police are involved, he'll only escalate." Henry placed a comforting hand on her arm. "Then we'll handle this another way. I'll hire private security to patrol the estate, and Charles is already working on a plan to expose Ryan's activities. We'll find a way to stop him." Emma hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you, Henry. I don't know what we'd do without you." Henry's expression softened. "You don't have to do this alone anymore." Despite the lingering tension, Henry encouraged Emma and Lila to continue working in the studio. One afternoon, as they sifted through Eleanor's old supplies, they discovered a leather-bound journal tucked away in a drawer. The pages were filled with sketches, notes, and personal reflections from Eleanor's years as an artist. "This was her process," Henry explained, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "She always believed art should come from the heart, not just the mind." Lila flipped through the pages with awe, her fingers tracing the delicate lines of Eleanor's sketches. "She was amazing," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "She would have loved you too," Henry said, his eyes glistening. "And I think she would have been proud of what you're creating here." Spurred by Eleanor's journal, Emma began experimenting with new techniques and styles. She painted vibrant landscapes, inspired by the vineyard, delicate portraits of Lila, and even abstract pieces that captured her emotional journey. Each brushstroke felt like a step toward reclaiming her identity, a defiant act against the fear Ryan had instilled in her. Henry watched her transformation with quiet pride. "You've found your spark again," he told her one evening, as they stood in the studio, admiring her latest work. Emma smiled, her confidence growing with each passing day. "I never thought I'd feel this way again. It's like I'm finally myself." But the peace was short-lived. Late one night, as Henry walked through the mansion's halls, he noticed a faint glow from the security monitors in his study. He stepped inside and froze. One of the cameras had captured a figure lingering near the guest house, a man in a dark coat, his face obscured by shadows. Henry quickly called the security team, who began patrolling the property. But the figure was gone, leaving only a chilling sense of unease in his wake. The dawn broke over the vineyard, but the sunlight did little to chase away the ominous tension that had settled on the Calloway estate. Emma stood by the guest house window, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. Her eyes scanned the tree line, searching for any sign of the shadowy figure Henry had spotted on the security cameras the night before. Though the vineyard appeared peaceful, Emma's heart raced with unease. Lila stirred awake, rubbing her eyes as she padded into the small kitchen. "Good morning, Mom," she said sleepily. Emma forced a smile, hiding her fear. "Good morning, sweetheart. Did you sleep well?" "Yeah," Lila replied, but her gaze lingered on her mother's face. "Mom, are you okay?" Emma knelt to Lila's level, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "I'm fine, honey. Just thinking about what we'll paint today." At the mansion, Henry was on the phone with Charles Grant, his trusted lawyer and old friend. His voice was low, laced with frustration. "Charles, we need to move faster on this. That man, Ryan, is getting bolder. He was on my property last night." Charles sighed on the other end. "I'm doing everything I can, Henry. We've gathered substantial evidence of his criminal activities, but building a case strong enough to involve federal authorities takes time." "We don't have time," Henry snapped. "Emma and Lila are in danger now." Charles hesitated, then replied, "There's another option. We could use a private investigator to speed things along, someone who isn't bound by the same red tape." "Do it," Henry said without hesitation. "Whatever it takes to protect them." Later that morning, Henry visited the guest house. He found Emma in the small garden behind the house, tending to the vegetable patch she had started. Lila sat nearby, sketching a butterfly perched on a tomato plant. "Emma," Henry said, his voice soft but urgent, "can we talk?" Emma wiped her hands on a towel and gestured for Lila to stay put. She followed Henry inside, closing the door behind her. His serious expression made her stomach twist. "Last night, one of the security cameras caught someone near the guest house," Henry said. "We're taking steps to ensure your safety. But I need to know more about Ryan. Who he is, what he wants. The more I know, the better I can help you." Emma sank into a chair, her hands trembling. For a moment she was silent, gathering her thoughts. Finally she began to speak, her voice heavy with emotion. "Ryan wasn't always like this," she said. "When I met him, he was charming, attentive. He owned a gallery in Chicago, and I thought he genuinely cared about my art. We got married quickly, and for a while it was good. But then, things changed." Emma's voice broke, but she pressed on. "He became controlling, critical. He said my paintings weren't good enough, that I should focus on what he wanted me to create. Then, I found out the truth. He was using his gallery as a front for selling forged artwork. When I confronted him, he became violent." Henry clenched his fists, his anger simmering beneath the surface. "And that's when you left?" Emma nodded. "I took Lila and ran. We've been on the move ever since. I thought I could stay ahead of him, but he always seems to find us." Henry listened intently, his respect for Emma growing with every word. "We'll stop him," he said firmly. "You're not alone in this anymore." Emma's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Thank you, Henry. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "You don't need to," Henry replied. "You've given this old house a reason to feel alive again. That's more than enough." Later that day, Emma and Lila returned to the studio. hoping to find solace in their art. Lila worked on a colorful depiction of the vineyard at sunset, her brush strokes full of youthful energy. Emma, inspired by her daughter's determination, began painting a piece that symbolized their journey. A stormy sky breaking into sunlight, with two figures standing hand in hand beneath it. Henry stopped by the studio to check on them, his gaze lingering on Emma's painting. "That's powerful," he said. "It tells a story." "It's our story," Emma replied softly, her eyes meeting his. "The storm isn't over yet, but we're getting there." That evening, as the family gathered for dinner in the mansion's dining room, a delivery truck pulled up at the gate. Miriam, ever vigilant, intercepted the package before it reached the house. She brought it to Henry, her face pale. "This just arrived," she said, setting a plain brown box on the table. Henry opened it cautiously, revealing another photograph of Emma and Lila, this time accompanied by a note that read, "You can't hide forever, Emma. I'm coming for you." Henry's grip tightened on the paper, his knuckles white. "That man is testing my patience," he muttered. Emma's face drained of color. "He's escalating." Henry stood, his expression resolute. "I'm calling the investigator tonight. This ends now." That night, as Emma tucked Lila into bed, she tried to hide her fear. Lila, however, was perceptive. "Mom, is someone trying to hurt us?" Emma hesitated, then leaned down to kiss Lila's forehead. "No one is going to hurt you, sweetheart. I promise." But as Emma stepped outside to take a breath of fresh air, her resolve wavered. The vineyard seemed darker than usual, the shadows deeper. Somewhere out there, Ryan was watching, waiting. The morning sun bathed the estate in a golden glow as Henry sat across from Emma and Lila at the breakfast table in the mansion's dining room. The smell of fresh-baked scones and coffee filled the air, but the tension from the previous night lingered like a shadow. "I've been thinking," Henry said, breaking the silence. His tone was measured, but his eyes betrayed a spark of excitement. "There's a children's art festival happening in town next weekend. Lila, I think it would be the perfect opportunity for you to showcase your talent." Lila's eyes lit up. "Really? You mean I can show my drawings?" "Absolutely," Henry replied. "And I think you'd be a hit." Emma hesitated, her fork pausing midway to her plate. "I don't know if that's a good idea, Henry." "What if—" Henry raised a hand gently. "Emma, I understand your concerns, but the festival is a public event, with plenty of people around. I'll hire additional security to ensure you and Lila are safe." Lila looked up at her mother with hopeful eyes. "Please, Mom, it sounds fun." Emma's resolve softened at her daughter's enthusiasm. After a moment's pause, she nodded. "Okay, but only if we can keep a low profile." Henry smiled. "That's settled then. I'll make the arrangements." The following days were a flurry of activity. Henry arranged for a booth at the festival and ensured it was in a well-trafficked but secure location. Miriam, ever the skeptic, voiced her concerns but begrudgingly helped by organizing supplies. Emma spent hours with Lila in the studio, selecting which pieces to display. Lila's excitement was infectious, and even Emma began to feel a flicker of hope. For the first time in years, they were doing something normal, something that felt like a step toward the life they'd once dreamed of. One evening, as Lila worked on her final piece, Emma stood by the window, watching the vineyard swaying gently in the evening breeze. Henry joined her, a cup of tea in hand. "She's happy," Henry said softly, nodding toward Lila. "You both deserve this." Emma turned to him, her expression conflicted. "It's hard to believe it's real. Every time things start to feel normal, Ryan finds a way to tear it apart. He won't this time, Henry replied firmly. We'll make sure of it. The town square buzzed with activity as colorful tents and booths lined the cobblestone streets. Children ran between displays, their laughter echoing against the backdrop of cheerful music. Emma and Lila's booth was decorated with fresh flowers from the Calloway estate, a simple but elegant touch that drew passers-by. Look, Mom, Lila said excitedly, pointing to a group of people admiring her sketches. They like them. Emma smiled, her heart swelling with pride. Of course they do. You're talented. Henry stood nearby, keeping a watchful eye on the crowd. His presence was both comforting and commanding, a silent assurance that nothing would go wrong. As the day progressed, Emma's initial excitement began to give way to unease. She scanned the crowd constantly, searching for any sign of Ryan. The memory of the threatening letter and photograph loomed large in her mind, casting a shadow over the day. Are you okay, Mom? Lila asked, noticing her mother's distracted demeanor. Emma forced a smile. I'm fine, sweetie, just making sure everything's okay. But her unease wasn't unwarranted. Across the square, a man in a dark coat lingered near a booth, his eyes fixed on Emma and Lila. He held a phone to his ear, speaking in hushed tones. Toward the late afternoon, as the festival was winding down, Henry approached Emma with a concerned expression. We need to leave, he said quietly. Emma's heart sank. Why? What's wrong? Henry gestured subtly toward the man in the dark coat. I've seen him watching your booth all day. I don't like it. Emma's pulse quickened. Do you think it's him? I'm not sure, Henry admitted. But I'm not taking any chances. I've already arranged for the car to meet us at the back entrance. Let's go. Emma nodded, her grip tightening on Lila's hand. They packed up quickly, with Miriam and Henry helping to load the artwork into the car. As they slipped away from the festival, Emma cast one last glance over her shoulder. The man was gone. When they returned to the estate, Emma felt a mix of relief and lingering fear. The festival had been a bittersweet reminder of what life could be. But Ryan's shadow loomed too large to ignore. I'm sorry, Emma said to Henry as they unloaded the car. I shouldn't have let us go. It was too risky. Henry shook his head. Don't apologize. Lila deserved to have this experience, and I'm glad she did. We just need to stay vigilant. Despite the day's tension, Lila was radiant with joy. She carried a folder of positive feedback from festival goers, her sketches earning admiration from strangers and fellow artists alike. Do you think I could be a real artist someday, Mr. Calloway? Lila asked, as they sat together in the guest house that evening. Henry smiled warmly. You already are, Lila. And you're going to do incredible things. The Calloway estate, typically tranquil under the early morning light, now felt suffocating. Inside the mansion, Henry sat in his study, the phone pressed to his ear as he listened to Charles's grim update. We've confirmed it, Henry. Ryan Blackwell has been spotted in Napa. He's asking questions, paying people to talk. He knows where they are. Henry's grip on the receiver tightened. How much time do we have? It's hard to say, Charles replied. But if he's already in town, he's not wasting time. Henry leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. We'll need to increase security, and we need a plan. I'll expedite the legal proceedings, Charles said. We're close to securing the evidence we need to involve the authorities, but it's not airtight yet. Make it airtight, Henry said firmly. We don't have room for error. Emma was in the guest house, her hands trembling, as she packed Lila's school books into a bag. The festival had been a bittersweet moment of normalcy, but the sight of the man in the dark coat had brought her worst fears to the forefront. Mom? Lila's voice broke through her thoughts. Are we going back to the studio today? Emma forced a smile, her heart aching at her daughter's innocence. Not today, sweetheart. We're going to stay close to the house for a little while. Lila frowned but didn't protest. She returned to her drawing, her pencil moving across the paper with quiet focus. Emma watched her, the weight of her responsibility pressing down harder than ever. That afternoon, Henry's worst fears were confirmed. One of the estate's security guards spotted a black sedan, parked just beyond the property line. The driver, a man matching Ryan's description, was seen taking photographs of the house and vineyard before driving away. Henry immediately called a meeting in the mansion's library. Emma, Miriam, and Charles, who had driven to the estate upon hearing the news, gathered around the large oak table. He's escalating, Henry said, pacing the room. We need to stay ahead of him. Emma's voice was barely above a whisper. What does he want? Why now? Charles cleared his throat. Ryan has a reputation for being ruthless, especially when he feels his control slipping. With the festival and Lila's art gaining attention, he probably sees an opportunity to exploit that for his gain. Emma's face paled. He doesn't care about Lila. He just wants to use her to hurt me. Henry stopped pacing and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. That won't happen. We'll make sure of it. That evening, as the sun set over the vineyard, Emma heard a knock at the guest house door. Her heart leaped into her throat as she approached cautiously, peeking through the window. She froze. It was Ryan. He stood there, dressed in a tailored suit, his face a mask of calm malice. Emma stepped back, her hands trembling. Before she could react further, Henry appeared, flanked by 2 security guards. Get off my property, Henry said, his voice cold and commanding. Ryan's smile didn't waver. Mr. Calloway, is it? I've heard a lot about you. Taking in strays, playing the hero. How noble. Henry took a step forward, his eyes blazing. You're trespassing. Leave now, or we'll have you removed. Ryan's expression darkened, but he raised his hands in mock surrender. Relax. I'm just here to talk. There's nothing to discuss, Henry replied. Ryan's gaze shifted toward the guest house. I think Emma might disagree. After all, she's been keeping something that belongs to me. Henry moved to block his view. Whatever claim you think you have is gone. You lost that the day you became a threat to her and Lila. Ryan's smile returned, but it was cold and dangerous. We'll see about that. He turned and walked back to his car, but not before calling over his shoulder. You can't protect them forever. Inside the guest house, Emma clutched Lila tightly, her heart racing. Henry entered, his face grim but determined. He's testing us, Henry said. Trying to scare you. It's working, Emma admitted, tears streaming down her face. I don't know how much more of this I can take. Henry knelt beside her, his voice soft but resolute. You're stronger than you think, Emma. And you're not alone in this. We'll fight him together. Later that night, Charles laid out a plan in the mansion's study. We need to gather enough evidence to take to the authorities. Ryan's history of fraud and abuse will work in our favor, but we need witnesses willing to testify. Emma shook her head. Ryan has scared everyone into silence. No one will come forward. Charles looked at Henry. What about the private investigator? I've already hired one, Henry replied. They're digging into Ryan's connections as we speak. The days following Ryan's appearance at the estate were fraught with tension. Security patrols had doubled, and Henry had installed additional surveillance cameras, but the unease was palpable. Emma barely slept, her mind replaying Ryan's threats over and over. Lila, sensing her mother's anxiety, tried her best to keep the mood light, but even her cheerful sketches couldn't dispel the dark cloud looming over their lives. Henry, ever the protector, had taken to spending hours in his study, coordinating with Charles and the private investigator. Despite his outward calm, his clenched fists and terse words betrayed his frustration. One evening, as Emma prepared dinner in the guest house, there was a knock at the door. Her heart skipped a beat, but when she peeked through the curtain, she saw a delivery driver holding a small package. Relieved, she opened the door. "This is for you," the man said, handing over the box before hurrying back to his truck. Emma set the box on the counter and hesitated before opening it. Inside was a single object, a child's stuffed bunny, Lila's favorite toy from years ago, one she thought had been left behind during their escape from Ryan. Attached to it was a note that read, "I always know where you are." Her hands shook as she dropped the toy and backed away, her breath coming in short gasps. The walls of the guest house seemed to close in around her as the weight of Ryan's menace pressed down on her chest. When Henry arrived minutes later, Emma was still trembling, the note clenched in her hand. Henry's face darkened as he read it, his fury barely contained. "He's taunting you," Henry said through gritted teeth, "trying to scare you into making a mistake." "It's working," Emma admitted, her voice breaking. "I don't know how to keep Lila safe from him." Henry placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "We'll keep her safe. But we need to stay strong. That's how we beat him." Despite the escalating tension, Lila remained blissfully unaware of the danger lurking around them. She spent her days in the studio, her art growing more intricate and expressive with each passing day. Her latest piece, a vibrant portrait of the vineyard at sunset, caught Henry's attention as he passed by one afternoon. "That's beautiful, Lila," Henry said, kneeling to admire her works. "You have a real gift." "Thanks, Mr. Calloway," Lila replied with a shy smile. "Mom says I should draw what makes me happy." Henry's heart ached at her innocence. He wished more than anything that he could shield her from the darkness creeping into their lives. Late one night, the security team alerted Henry to an intruder near the estate's perimeter. Henry rushed to the control room, where the grainy footage from one of the cameras showed a man matching Ryan's description, attempting to disable a motion sensor. "Call the police," Henry ordered the head of security, "and alert the guards." By the time the authorities arrived, Ryan had vanished, leaving behind only a cut wire and a deepening sense of dread. The next morning, Emma sat on the edge of her bed, her face pale and her hands clenched into fists. She had reached her breaking point. The constant fear, the sleepless nights, the threat hanging over her and Lila. It was too much. When Henry came to check on her, she looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. "I can't do this anymore, Henry. I can't keep running, keep hiding. He's never going to stop." Henry sat beside her, his expression gentle but firm. "Then we make him stop. But we need to be smart about it. Let Charles and the investigator do their jobs. We'll gather the evidence we need to put him away for good." Emma nodded, though her shoulders remained heavy with doubt. Later that day, Charles arrived at the estate with news. "We've uncovered more evidence of Ryan's illegal activities, art forgery, money laundering, and tax evasion. It's enough to build a case, but we need one more piece to tie him directly to his crimes." "What do you need?" Henry asked. "A witness," Charles replied. "Someone who can testify to his actions." Emma's face fell. "No one will come forward. Ryan's scared them all into silence." Charles hesitated. "There is one person who might help. One of his former associates, a gallery manager named Daniel Green. He worked closely with Ryan for years before they had a falling out. If we can convince him to testify, it could be the nail in the coffin. Henry nodded. Find him. Offer him whatever protection he needs. That evening, Emma ventured into the studio, hoping to find solace in painting. As she worked on a new piece, a stormy depiction of the vineyard at night, she heard a faint noise outside. Her pulse quickened as she set down her brush and moved toward the window. In the shadows near the guest house, a figure stood watching her. It was Ryan. Emma froze, her mind racing. Before she could react, Ryan smirked and disappeared into the darkness. She rushed to the main house, where she found Henry in the study. He was here, she said breathlessly. I saw him. Henry's jaw tightened, and he picked up the phone. It's time to end this. The Calloway estate hummed with activity as Henry and Charles worked tirelessly to bring Ryan to justice. The new security measures had restored a small sense of safety, but the tension remained palpable. Emma busied herself with household tasks, while Lila continued to lose herself in her sketches. They were trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy, but the shadow of Ryan's presence loomed over them all. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Charles arrived at the mansion with a folder tucked under his arm. His expression was a mix of exhaustion and triumph. We've found him, Charles announced as he entered Henry's study. Daniel Green. He's living in Seattle under a different name. He's been keeping a low profile, but he's agreed to meet. Henry nodded. That's the break we need. Emma, who had been listening quietly from the corner of the room, stepped forward. Will he testify? Charles hesitated. He's willing to talk, but he's scared. Ryan ruined his career and threatened his family when they had their falling out. We'll need to convince him that we can protect him. The next morning, Henry, Emma, and Charles boarded a private plane to Seattle. Lila stayed behind, under the watchful eye of Miriam and the estate's security team. Emma had been reluctant to leave her daughter, but Henry assured her it was the safest option. As they flew over the Pacific Northwest, Emma stared out the window, her mind racing. What if he won't help us? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry reached over and placed a reassuring hand on her arm. He will. We'll make sure of it. Daniel Green lived in a modest apartment in the heart of Seattle. When he opened the door, his cautious eyes darted from Henry to Charles, to Emma. He was a thin man in his late 40s, with a nervous energy that spoke of years spent looking over his shoulder. Come in, he said, stepping aside to let them enter. The apartment was small but tidy, filled with books and framed photographs of a smiling woman and 2 children. Daniel gestured for them to sit on the couch as he poured coffee for everyone. I'm not sure how much help I can be, Daniel began, his hands trembling as he held his cup. Ryan? He's not the kind of man you cross lightly. We understand, Charles said, his tone calm and measured. But the more people who come forward, the stronger our case against him. If we can put him behind bars, he won't be able to hurt anyone else. Daniel hesitated, his gaze flickering to Emma. You're the woman he's after, aren't you? Emma nodded, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. He's been hunting me for years. I just want to protect my daughter. Daniel sighed heavily and set his cup down. Ryan was a master manipulator. He used his charm to win people over, then exploited them for his own gain. I saw him forge paintings, launder money through the gallery, even blackmail collectors. I knew it was wrong, but I was in too deep before I realized what was happening. Why did you leave? Henry asked. Daniel's jaw tightened. I threatened to expose him. He retaliated by sending threats to my family. I had no choice but to disappear. Over the course of the conversation, Daniel provided a wealth of information about Ryan's criminal activities including names, dates, and locations. Charles took meticulous notes, his pen flying across the pages of his notebook. "This is exactly what we need," Charles said, his voice tinged with hope. "With your testimony, we can build a case that will hold up in court." Daniel hesitated, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "I'll testify, but only if you can guarantee my family's safety." "You have my word," Henry said, his tone firm. "I'll do whatever it takes to protect you and your loved ones." As they flew back to Napa, Emma felt a glimmer of hope. For the first time in years, Daniel's testimony could be the key to finally ending Ryan's reign of terror. But her relief was tempered by the knowledge that Ryan wouldn't go down without a fight. When they arrived at the estate, Lila ran to greet them, her arms wrapping tightly around Emma. "Did you catch the bad guy?" she asked, her innocent eyes filled with curiosity. "Not yet," Emma replied, kneeling to hug her daughter. "But we're getting closer." The next morning, Henry received a chilling phone call. Ryan's voice was calm but menacing. "You think you can outsmart me, Calloway? You're in over your head." Henry's grip on the phone tightened. "You've already lost, Ryan. It's only a matter of time." Ryan chuckled darkly. "We'll see about that." When Henry hung up, his expression was grim. He called Charles immediately, relaying the conversation. "He knows we're closing in. He's going to escalate." That evening, as the family sat down for dinner, the tension was palpable. The estate's security team had been increased, and every door and window was locked tight. But despite their precautions, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that Ryan was watching, waiting for his next move. In a dark room miles away, Ryan stared at a map of the Calloway estate. His fingers traced the property lines as a sinister smile spread across his face. "They think they're safe," he muttered to himself, "but they're not." The Calloway estate was a hive of activity as preparations for the legal battle against Ryan Blackwell reached a fever pitch. Charles worked tirelessly in the study, surrounded by stacks of files and witness statements. Henry coordinated with the private investigator, ensuring every piece of evidence was airtight. Emma spent her days trying to maintain a sense of normalcy for Lila, but the tension was impossible to ignore. "Mom," Lila said one afternoon, as she colored in the studio. "Why does everyone seem so worried?" Emma hesitated, searching for the right words. "Sometimes grown-ups have to work hard to fix big problems," she said gently. "But you don't need to worry. Mr. Calloway and I are taking care of everything." Lila nodded, her trust in her mother unshaken. But Emma couldn't ignore the pang of guilt in her chest. She hated that her daughter had to live under the shadow of Ryan's threats. The first major move in the legal battle came when Ryan filed for custody of Lila, claiming Emma was an unfit mother due to her history of homelessness and instability. The news hit Emma like a physical blow. "He's trying to use my worst moments against me," Emma said, her voice shaking as she sat in Henry's study. "That's exactly why we need to fight this head-on," Charles replied firmly. "We have more than enough evidence to prove you're a loving and capable mother." Henry placed a reassuring hand on Emma's shoulder. "We're going to win this, Emma. Lila belongs with you." Charles worked around the clock to build a solid case. He compiled testimony from Daniel Green, evidence of Ryan's criminal activities, and character references from Henry, Miriam, and others who had seen Emma's devotion to Lila. Every detail was scrutinized and double-checked to ensure there were no weak points. One evening, as the team reviewed the files, Emma looked at a photograph of Lila smiling in the garden. "She's my whole world," Emma said quietly. "I can't let him take her." Charles nodded. "And we won't. But we need to stay strong. This is going to be a fight." True to form, Ryan didn't play fair. He leaked false stories about Emma to the local press, painting her as irresponsible and unstable. The articles were filled with lies, but they stirred up enough attention to make Emma feel exposed and vulnerable. "We can refute this," Charles assured her. "The court will see it for what it is, an attempt to discredit you." But Emma's confidence wavered. "He always seems to stay one step ahead," she murmured. "Not this time," Henry said firmly. "We've got the truth on our side." The day of the custody hearing arrived, and the courtroom was packed. Emma sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands clasped tightly together. Across the room, Ryan sat with his lawyer, his smug expression a stark contrast to Emma's anxiety. The judge, a stern woman with piercing eyes, called the proceedings to order. Ryan's lawyer began with a scathing argument, painting Emma as a flight risk and an unfit mother. Ryan played his part, feigning concern for Lila's well-being. When it was Charles's turn to speak, he presented a compelling case, highlighting Emma's efforts to provide a stable life for Lila and exposing Ryan's history of abuse and manipulation. He introduced Daniel Green as a witness, whose testimony about Ryan's criminal activities was a turning point. When Emma took the stand, her voice trembled at first, but she steadied herself as she spoke about her love for Lila and her determination to protect her. She recounted the years of fear and hardship, but also the moments of hope and joy that kept her going. "Lila is my everything," Emma said, tears streaming down her face. "Everything I've done has been for her." Her heartfelt testimony moved many in the courtroom, including the judge, who nodded thoughtfully as she listened. When it was Ryan's turn to testify, his arrogance was his undoing. Under cross-examination, he grew defensive and combative, inadvertently revealing inconsistencies in his story. Charles seized the opportunity, pressing him on his history of fraud and threats. "You've made a career out of exploiting others," Charles said, his tone sharp. "Why should the court believe you have Lila's best interests at heart?" Ryan's mask of composure cracked, and his true nature was laid bare for everyone to see. After hours of deliberation, the judge returned with her verdict. She ruled in Emma's favor, granting her full custody of Lila and issuing a restraining order against Ryan. When the decision was announced, Emma collapsed into Henry's arms, overwhelmed with relief. Lila, who had been waiting outside with Miriam, ran into the courtroom and hugged her mother tightly. "Does this mean we're safe now?" Lila asked, her voice muffled against Emma's shoulder. "Yes, sweetheart," Emma replied, her tears flowing freely. "We're safe." That evening, the Calloway estate was filled with a sense of triumph. Miriam prepared a celebratory dinner, and the entire household gathered to toast to Emma's victory. Lila's laughter echoed through the halls, a sound that felt like sunshine breaking through a storm. Henry raised his glass, his voice steady with emotion. "To Emma and Lila, a family worth fighting for." As the evening wound down, Emma and Henry stood on the veranda, looking out over the vineyard. The threat of Ryan seemed to have lifted, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't finished. "Do you think it's really over?" she asked softly. Henry's expression was thoughtful. "We've won this battle, but I have a feeling he'll try something else. We need to stay vigilant." In the distance, the vineyard swayed gently in the night breeze, a reminder of the peace they were fighting to protect. The days following the custody hearing brought a newfound sense of peace to the Calloway estate. Emma and Lila began to settle into a rhythm, one that felt less like hiding and more like living. The threat of Ryan seemed to have diminished, and for the first time in years, Emma allowed herself to breathe. Henry watched this transformation with quiet satisfaction. He saw Emma smile more, laugh with Lila, and even begin painting again in Eleanor's old studio. The once empty guest house now buzzed with life, And Henry felt a sense of pride, knowing he had played a part in creating that. But beneath the surface of this newfound calm lay an undercurrent of uncertainty. Both Henry and Emma knew that Ryan was not the kind of man to accept defeat. One crisp autumn afternoon, as Emma and Lila worked together on a mural in the studio, Miriam approached with a cautious expression. "Mr. Calloway," she said, finding Henry in the library. "There's someone at the gate, asking to speak with you." Henry frowned. "Who is it?" "He wouldn't give his name," Miriam replied. "But he says he has information about Ryan Blackwell." Henry's eyes narrowed. "Bring him to the side entrance. I'll meet him there." At the side entrance, a man in his late 30s stood waiting, his demeanor nervous but determined. He introduced himself as Jason Connors, a former associate of Ryan's, who claimed to have critical information. "Why come to me?" Henry asked, his tone skeptical. "Because Ryan is out of control," Jason said, his voice low. "He's been making deals with dangerous people, laundering money through international channels. He's desperate to rebuild his reputation after the custody case, and he's willing to do whatever it takes, even if it means hurting more people." Henry's jaw tightened. "What do you want from me?" Jason hesitated. "Protection, and a chance to make things right. I have documents, emails, and account records that can tie Ryan to a network of criminal activity. But if he finds out I've come to you, you'll be safe," Henry assured him. "Give us the information, and we'll make sure it gets to the authorities." When Henry shared the news with Emma, her reaction was a mix of hope and fear. "Do you think this is enough to stop him for good?" she asked. "It could be," Henry replied. "But we need to be careful. If Jason is telling the truth, Ryan will stop at nothing to silence him." Emma nodded, but her unease lingered. The idea of Ryan's reach extending even further was a chilling reminder of how precarious their situation remained. That night, the tranquility of the estate was shattered. An explosion rocked the edge of the vineyard, sending flames and smoke into the sky. The security team quickly doused the fire, but the damage was done. Ryan had sent a clear message. Emma clutched Lila tightly in the guest house as Henry assessed the scene with the authorities. "It's a warning," the fire chief said grimly. "Whoever did this wanted to make sure you knew they could get close." Henry's expression darkened. "We won't let him win." The next morning, Charles arrived with urgent news. "Jason's documents are explosive," he said, spreading them out on Henry's desk. "Bank transfers, fake invoices, offshore accounts. It's all here. Enough to not only put Ryan away, but also dismantle his entire operation." Emma stood behind Henry, her hands clenched into fists. "So, what happens now?" "We turn this over to the FBI," Charles said. "They'll open a full investigation, but it could take time, and Ryan won't go down without a fight." Henry nodded. "Then we'll make sure he doesn't have a chance to fight back." Later that evening, as the family gathered for dinner, the power suddenly went out. The estate plunged into darkness, and the hum of the backup generators failed to kick in. Henry's instincts took over. "Stay here," he said firmly to Emma and Lila, reaching for the emergency flashlight. "Miriam, call the security team." Moments later, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. Henry turned to see a shadowy figure approaching, and his heart raced. He stepped forward, determined to protect his family at all costs. The figure stepped into the light of the flashlight. It was Ryan. "Well, well," Ryan said, his tone dripping with malice. "The great Henry Calloway playing hero." "This ends now," Henry said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Ryan smirked. "You think you've won. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Before Henry could respond, The security team arrived, weapons drawn. Ryan hesitated, his bravado faltering, as he realized he was outnumbered. "You're done, Blackwell," Henry said. "You've run out of chances." The authorities arrived minutes later, taking Ryan into custody. As he was led away in handcuffs, he turned to Emma, his eyes filled with venom. "This isn't over," he spat. Emma stood her ground, her voice firm. "Yes, it is." The following morning, as the first rays of sunlight bathed the vineyard in golden light, Emma and Lila joined Henry on the veranda. The air was crisp, and the weight that had hung over them for so long seemed to have lifted. "Is it really over?" Lila asked, looking up at her mother. Emma smiled, brushing a strand of hair from Lila's face. "Yes, sweetheart. It's finally over." Henry watched the exchange with a sense of quiet pride. The battle had been long and arduous, but they had prevailed. The days following Ryan's arrest brought a quiet relief to the Calloway estate. The vineyard, once overshadowed by tensions and fear, now seemed alive with new energy. Emma and Lila began to experience life without constantly looking over their shoulders, and for the first time in years, laughter filled the halls of the mansion. Henry found himself deeply moved by the transformation. Lila's drawings had grown brighter, filled with vibrant colors and images of joy. Emma, too, had returned to her painting with renewed vigor, her canvases reflecting a sense of hope that had long been absent. One crisp morning, Henry received a call he hadn't expected. His son, Michael, was on the other end of the line. "Dad," Michael began hesitantly, "I heard about what's been happening. Are you okay?" Henry's chest tightened at the sound of his son's voice. It had been years since they'd spoken meaningfully. "We're managing," Henry replied, his voice softer than he intended. "It's been a difficult time, but I think we're finally turning a corner." There was a pause on the line before Michael spoke again. "I'd like to come visit, if that's okay." Henry's heart lifted. "I'd like that very much." When Michael arrived later that week, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Emma and Lila gave them space, retreating to the studio, while Henry greeted his son at the front door. Michael, now in his 40s, carried an air of quiet confidence, but looked hesitant as he stepped inside. "The house hasn't changed much," he remarked, his gaze sweeping the grand entryway. Henry chuckled. "I've always been a creature of habit." The two men stood in awkward silence for a moment, before Henry broke it. "I'm glad you're here, Michael." Michael met his father's eyes. "I've missed you, Dad." Over the next few days, father and son began to mend their fractured relationship. They took long walks through the vineyard, discussing everything from business to memories of Eleanor. Henry shared stories about Emma and Lila, and Michael expressed admiration for their resilience. One evening, as they sat on the veranda overlooking the estate, Michael turned to his father. "You've changed, Dad. You seem happier." Henry smiled, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I've realized that life isn't about the things we accumulate, but the people we share it with." Emma and Lila reminded me of that. Michael nodded thoughtfully. "I'd like to meet them." The following night, Henry hosted a family dinner in the mansion's dining room. Emma and Lila joined Michael and Henry at the table, and the atmosphere was warm and welcoming. "You must be Lila," Michael said, with a kind smile as he shook the young girl's hand. "I've heard a lot about you." Lila beamed. "I've heard about you too. Mr. Calloway says you're really good at fixing things." Michael laughed. "I suppose I am. Maybe I can help out around here." Emma watched the exchange with a sense of gratitude. Seeing Michael and Henry together, she realized how much Henry had longed for this moment. She hoped it would mark the beginning of something new for all of them. With the threat of Ryan gone, Emma began to focus on her art in earnest. She completed a series of paintings inspired by her journey, each piece telling a story of resilience, love, and redemption. Henry, ever supportive, suggested showcasing her work at a local gallery. "Your art deserves to be seen," Henry said, as he admired one of her canvases, "and it could inspire others who've faced similar struggles." Emma hesitated. "Do you really think people would connect with it?" "I know they will," Henry replied with conviction. "Your story is one of hope, Emma, and the world could use more of that." Meanwhile, Lila's artistic talent continued to blossom. With Henry's encouragement, she began entering local art competitions and even won a scholarship for a summer art program. The once shy girl had found her voice through her drawings, and her confidence grew with each passing day. One afternoon, as Lila worked on a sketch in the garden, Michael joined her. "What are you drawing?" he asked, crouching beside her. "It's a picture of the vineyard," Lila replied, holding up her work. "Do you like it?" Michael studied the drawing and nodded. "It's beautiful. You've got real talent, Lila." "Thanks," Lila said with a smile. "Mr. Calloway, Grandpa, always says the same thing." Michael's heart swelled at the mention of his father. "He's right, and you're lucky to have him." As the weeks turned into months, the Calloway estate became a true home for Emma and Lila. The once lonely mansion was now filled with life, laughter, and the promise of a brighter future. Emma's art gained recognition in the community, and she began receiving commissions from local patrons. Lila thrived in her art program, and her bond with Henry and Michael deepened. The wounds of the past had not disappeared entirely, but they were healing, slowly but surely. One evening, during a family gathering in the studio, Henry stood and raised a glass. "I have something I'd like to say," he began, his voice filled with emotion. Emma, Lila, Michael, and Miriam looked at him expectantly. "This house has always been a place of memories, some joyful, some painful. But since you came into my life, Emma and Lila, it's become a place of hope. You've reminded me of what truly matters, and for that, I'm deeply grateful." Henry turned to Michael. "And having you here, son, has made it complete." The room erupted in applause, and Lila hugged Henry tightly. "We love you, Grandpa," she said. "I love you too, sweetheart," Henry replied, his voice thick with emotion. As the family celebrated, the camera pans to a letter resting on Henry's desk. A notice from a prominent gallery in San Francisco offering to host an exhibition of Emma and Lila's artwork. It was a new chapter waiting to be written, a testament to their journey and the strength of the family they had built together. The Calloway estate had undergone a remarkable transformation. Where once it had been a somber, lonely place, it was now filled with laughter, creativity, and the warmth of family. The vineyard thrived, and Henry reveled in the joy of seeing Emma and Lila flourish under his roof. Emma's art studio, once Eleanor's cherished haven, now brimmed with vibrant energy. Canvases leaned against every available surface, each one telling a story of resilience and hope. Lila's drawings added a playful touch, her colorful creations adorning the walls, alongside her mother's work. Miriam, who had been cautious of Emma and Lila's arrival, had become a steadfast supporter. She often brought snacks to the studio, her once formal demeanor softening as she watched the new life that had taken root in the estate. The letter from the San Francisco Gallery, offering an exhibition, had sparked a whirlwind of activity. Emma was initially hesitant, unsure if she was ready to share her deeply personal work with the world. But Henry and Michael encouraged her, and Lila's unwavering belief in her mother gave her the confidence to move forward. One afternoon, Emma stood before her collection, her hands trembling, as she surveyed the paintings she planned to showcase. Each piece represented a chapter of her journey, from the darkness of her past to the light she had found in her new life. "I'm scared," Emma admitted to Henry as he joined her in the studio. "Fear is a good sign," Henry said with a reassuring smile. "It means you're doing something important." In addition to Emma's paintings, the gallery had requested a section dedicated to Lila's work. The young girl's talent had not gone unnoticed, and her drawings had a charm and depth that captivated everyone who saw them. "Do you think people will like my pictures?" Lila asked one evening as she worked on a new piece. Henry crouched beside her, studying her sketch of the vineyard at sunset. "They won't just like them, Lila. They'll love them. You have a gift, and it's meant to be shared." Lila beamed, her confidence growing with each passing day. Michael, eager to support his father and the new family that had brought him back to the estate, offered to handle the logistics of the gallery show. His years of experience in business proved invaluable as he coordinated shipping, marketing, and event planning. "This is going to be a night to remember," Michael said as he finalized the guest list. "Emma, you and Lila deserve to be celebrated." Emma smiled, her gratitude shining through. "Thank you, Michael. This means so much to us." The gallery in San Francisco was abuzz with excitement on the night of the exhibition. Guests mingled among the artwork, their expressions ranging from admiration to awe as they took in the powerful pieces on display. Emma's collection, titled Reflections of Resilience, featured paintings that captured her emotional journey. Lila's section, A Child's Perspective, offered a whimsical yet profound view of the world through a young artist's eyes. Henry stood at the center of it all, his chest swelling with pride as he watched Emma and Lila bask in the admiration of the crowd. Michael, ever the supportive son, made sure every detail of the evening went smoothly. As Emma spoke with a group of art critics, a familiar face appeared in the crowd. It was Daniel Green, the gallery manager who had testified against Ryan. He approached Emma with a warm smile. "Emma," Daniel said, extending his hand, "your work is extraordinary. It's an honor to see it displayed like this." Emma shook his hand, her gratitude evident. "Thank you, Daniel. Your courage helped make this possible." Daniel nodded. "And I'm not the only one who thinks so. There's someone else who wants to meet you." To Emma's surprise, a prominent art dealer stepped forward, praising her work and offering to represent her professionally. The opportunity was overwhelming, but Emma felt ready to embrace this new chapter. As the evening wound down, Henry found himself alone in a quiet corner of the gallery, watching Emma and Lila interact with the guests. His mind drifted back to the day he had first seen them at the gates of his estate. How far they had all come since that moment. Michael joined him, holding 2 glasses of champagne. "You did a good thing, Dad," he said, handing one to Henry. "This family you've built, it's something special." Henry raised his glass. "Here's to new beginnings." Back at the estate, as they gathered on the veranda to celebrate the success of the exhibition, Michael proposed an idea. "What if we turned the estate into a community arts center?" he suggested. "We could use the guest houses and studio spaces to support aspiring artists." Emma's eyes lit up. "That's a beautiful idea." Henry nodded thoughtfully. It would be a fitting way to honor Eleanor's legacy and to give back to the community. The idea quickly took root, and plans were made to transform the estate into a haven for creativity and collaboration. The transformation of the Callaway estate into a thriving community arts center was well underway. The once silent grounds now hummed with life as artists from all walks of life gathered to create, learn, and collaborate. Emma had taken on the role of mentor, guiding young and aspiring painters, while Lila became a beacon of inspiration for her peers, her vibrant sketches gracing the walls of the new gallery space. Henry observed this new chapter with a sense of fulfillment he hadn't felt in years. The estate, which had once symbolized his loneliness, had become a haven of creativity and connection. As a way to commemorate the journey they had all undertaken, Emma proposed a collaborative project, a massive mural that would span an entire wall of the estate's new gallery. It would tell the story of resilience, family, and the power of second chances. "This mural will be our legacy," Emma explained during a family meeting in the studio. "Something that reflects not just our story, but the stories of everyone who finds hope here." Lila's eyes sparkled with excitement. "Can I draw part of it, Mom?" "Of course, sweetheart," Emma replied. "Everyone will contribute." While sorting through old storage boxes in preparation for the mural, Emma stumbled upon a small, tattered journal. Flipping through its pages, she recognized the handwriting. It belonged to her late husband, Ryan. Though the sight of his words sent a chill down her spine, Emma realized that confronting this piece of her past was a necessary step toward healing. She brought the journal to Henry, who encouraged her to read it aloud. Together they pored over its contents, uncovering glimpses of the man Ryan had been, before greed and ambition consumed him. "It's painful to read," Emma admitted, her voice trembling. "But it reminds me that even he had moments of humanity." Henry nodded thoughtfully. "Acknowledging the past doesn't mean we're defined by it. It's a part of the story, but not the whole story." The creation of the mural brought everyone together. Artists from the community contributed their talents, each section of the wall reflecting a unique perspective. Lila's portion featured a whimsical depiction of the vineyard, while Emma painted a powerful image of a mother and daughter holding hands, surrounded by light. Michael, who had never considered himself artistic, even picked up a brush. With Lila's guidance, he painted a small but heartfelt tribute to his late mother, Eleanor, a delicate flower blooming amidst a storm. As the mural grew, it became a living testament to the resilience and unity that had brought them all to this moment. Amidst the flurry of activity, Emma prepared her submission for the prestigious international art competition. Her chosen piece was a hauntingly beautiful painting titled "Breaking Chains," which depicted a woman stepping out of shadows into the light. The painting encapsulated her journey from fear to freedom. "I'm proud of you," Henry said, as Emma carefully packaged the painting. "No matter what happens, your story has already made an impact." Emma smiled, her confidence bolstered by Henry's unwavering support. "Thank you, Henry, for everything." The day of the mural's unveiling arrived, drawing a crowd of local residents, artists, and supporters. The event was filled with laughter, music, and heartfelt speeches. Henry took the stage to address the gathering, his one eye steady and warm. "This estate has been many things over the years," Henry began. "But today, it becomes what my late wife, Eleanor, always dreamed it could be. A place where creativity and connection thrive. To Emma and Lila, thank you for showing me the true meaning of family. And to all of you, thank you for making this dream a reality." The crowd erupted in applause as Henry gestured toward the mural, now fully completed. Its vibrant colors and intricate details told a story that resonated deeply with everyone present. As the evening wound down, Emma's phone buzzed with a call from the International Art Competition. With trembling hands, she answered, her heart pounding in her chest. "Miss Porter," the voice on the other end said, "we are pleased to inform you that your submission, Breaking Chains, has been selected as a finalist. We believe your work embodies the spirit of resilience and hope that our competition seeks to celebrate. Tears welled up in Emma's eyes as she shared the news with Henry and Lila. "I never imagined this would happen," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You deserve it, Mom," Lila exclaimed, throwing her arms around her mother. "Your story is amazing." Later that night, Henry sat alone on the veranda, gazing out at the moonlit vineyard. He thought about the journey that had brought them all here, the challenges they had faced, the bonds they had formed, and the lives they had transformed. For so long, Henry had believed his life was nearing its end, that his days of purpose and joy were behind him. But Emma and Lila had shown him otherwise. They had reminded him that it was never too late to find meaning, to create something beautiful, and to build a family. As Emma joined him on the veranda, a cup of tea in hand, Henry smiled. "You know," he said, his voice tinged with gratitude, "this place feels alive again. And so do I." Emma placed a hand on his. "That's because you opened your heart, Henry. You gave us a chance, and in doing so, you gave yourself one too." As the camera fades to black, the narrator's voice softly comes in, brimming with warmth and sincerity. Life has a way of surprising us, doesn't it? It takes us through twists and turns, challenging us to rise above and embrace second chances. Just like Henry, Emma, and Lila, we all have the power to turn pain into purpose, to find beauty in resilience, and to create a family where love can flourish. Pause. If this story touched your heart, let us know in the comments. What moment moved you the most? What would you do if given a second chance? We'd love to hear your thoughts. The voice brightens, carrying a sense of anticipation. And if you want more stories like this, tales of hope, courage, and redemption, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This is just the beginning. There are so many more stories waiting to inspire you. Don't miss the next chapter. The screen transitions to an elegant end card with the words, "Subscribe now," because every heart has a story to tell. The background music crescendos softly, leaving viewers with a lingering sense of hope and a desire to come back for more.